If you're left-handed, your DNA is about to reveal something scientists have kept hidden for years. But here's the shocking truth that I'm about to share with you. It might not be what you think. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you will completely change how you see your genetic code and everything you believed about your ancestry. For generations, we've been sold a compelling narrative. We're told that our DNA is like a time machine, a mystical blueprint written in the language of 4 chemical bases. We're told that inside those helixes of DNA lies the complete story of who we are, where we come from, what we're capable of, even the hidden potential locked inside us waiting to be discovered. And for the most part, this narrative has been extraordinarily profitable. Companies have built billion-dollar empires on the promise that genetic testing can unlock these mysteries. They advertise ancestry tests, promising to reveal your ethnic background, your geographic origins, your family's epic journey across continents and through centuries. The marketing is brilliant, emotionally resonant, and deeply compelling. But when it comes to left-handedness, the story becomes far more complicated and far less profitable. The companies selling genetic tests want you to believe that left-handedness is a special marker, a unique genetic signature that separates you from the right-handed majority and reveals something profound about your ancestry. They suggest that being left-handed means something beyond just preferring to write with your left hand. They imply that it's a window into your family's past, a clue about where your ancestors came from, what populations they belong to, what migrations they undertook. Here's what the actual science says about all of this. It says the companies are wrong. The research from 2024 and 2025 tells a completely different story than what you're hearing in advertisements. Let me explain how we got here. For decades, scientists have been fascinated by handedness. Right-handed people make up about 90% of humanity. Left-handed people account for roughly 10%. This ratio has been consistent across all recorded history, across all recorded cultures, across all documented time periods. Archaeological evidence from the Paleolithic period, more than 2.5 million years ago, shows cave paintings that reveal both right-handed and left-handed people existed then. Ancient civilizations in Greece, Rome, China, Mesopotamia, and Egypt all had populations with similar proportions of left-handers. This consistency across time and geography is extraordinary. It suggests that handedness isn't a recent development, isn't a mutation specific to certain populations, isn't a marker that varies meaningfully across the world's different ancestral groups. Yet something changed in how we treat left-handedness, even if the proportion didn't change. Throughout much of recorded history, particularly in Western cultures, being left-handed was seen as abnormal, undesirable, something to be corrected. In schools, children who naturally preferred their left hand were forced to switch to their right hand. Teachers would tie their left arms. Parents were advised to train their children to use the right hand for writing, eating, and other daily tasks. This wasn't universal in its timing or intensity, but it was widespread geographically. Then something crucial happened. Beginning around the 1930s, attitudes started to shift. Western societies, particularly North America and Western Europe, gradually became more accepting of left-handedness. Educational policies changed. Cultural attitudes evolved. Parents stopped forcing their children to switch hands. And what happened immediately after? The reported rates of left-handedness increased, not because the genetic composition of populations had changed, not because mutations suddenly swept through populations, not because new left-handed genes emerged. The rates increased because social pressure had decreased, allowing people to actually use their natural preference. This is the critical insight that completely undermines the idea that left-handedness reveals your ancestry. The geographic variation in left-handedness isn't genetic. It's social. It's historical. It reflects when different countries and cultures decided to stop suppressing left-handedness. It reflects different educational philosophies, different cultural values, different acceptance of human variation and neurodiversity. Now, let's talk about what science has actually discovered about the genetics of left-handedness. Starting in 2023 and continuing through 2024, some of the largest genetic studies ever conducted focused on this question. Researchers collaborated across multiple massive databases. The UK Biobank provided data from hundreds of thousands of people. 23andMe contributed data from millions of their customers. The International Handedness Consortium pulled together data from decades of smaller studies conducted around the world. The combined dataset included approximately 1,500,000 right-handed individuals, roughly 194,000 left-handed individuals, and about 37,000 ambidextrous individuals. That's nearly 2 million people whose hand preference and genetic code were analyzed. With a dataset of that magnitude, researchers could search through the entire human genome looking for genetic variants associated with being left-handed. What did they find? They identified 41 distinct genetic variants that showed statistical association with left-handedness, 41 different locations in the human genome, where variations correlated with the likelihood of being left-handed. This was a breakthrough discovery. It meant that left-handedness isn't controlled by a single gene. It's a polygenic trait, meaning multiple genes contribute to it. Each variant has an incredibly small individual effect, but collectively, they influence hand preference. Here's where the story gets interesting and where it diverges dramatically from what marketing companies want you to believe. When researchers calculated the total contribution of all these 41 genetic variants to left-handedness, they found something humbling. These common genetic variants explained somewhere between 1 and 6% of the variation in left-handedness. 1 to 6%, that means 94 to 99% of whether someone is left-handed comes from somewhere other than these common genetic variants. The researchers didn't stop there. In April 2024, a team published additional findings in Nature Communications. They had access to exome data, which is genetic information, specifically about the parts of the genome that code for proteins. They examined 38,000 left-handed individuals and 313,000 right-handed individuals, searching for rare genetic variants, mutations that appear in less than 1% of the population. Maybe, they reasoned, these rare variants would hold the key to understanding left-handedness. They discovered that rare variants did indeed show some association with left-handedness. One gene in particular, called TUB4B, which codes for a protein involved in forming the cellular structures called microtubules, showed significantly higher rates of variation in left-handed people. Specifically, variations in this gene were 2.7 times more common in left-handers than right-handers. This was a concrete finding, something measurable and real. But even this dramatic difference proved to be less significant than expected. When researchers calculated how much of the genetic variation in left-handedness could be explained by rare variants, they found it accounted for 0.91%, less than 1%. So now we have an accounting of genetic contribution. Common variants explain 1 to 6%. Rare variants explain less than 1%. Together, that's a maximum of about 7% of genetic variation. Yet we know from twin studies that the total heritability of left-handedness is approximately 25%. This means there are massive gaps in our understanding. There are genetic factors we haven't discovered yet, or there are complex interactions between genes and environment that we don't yet fully comprehend. Let me put this in perspective for you, because this is actually the most important part of the entire story. If only 25% of left-handedness is heritable, that means 75% is determined by environmental factors. 75%, that's the dominant factor. That's what shapes whether someone ends up being left-handed or right-handed. It's their environment, it's their experiences, it's their upbringing. It's random variation in how their brain develops during critical developmental periods. This is nothing like what the marketing wants you to imagine. The marketing wants you to believe that your DNA is deterministic, that it writes your destiny, that inside your genes is the truth of who you are and where you came from. The reality is that your DNA is more like a set of suggestions, a collection of predispositions, a possibility space within which development unfolds. And for something like left-handedness, that suggestion is only responsible for about 1/4 of the final outcome. Now let's talk about the specific genes they've identified. Beyond TUB4B, researchers found associations with multiple other genes. FOXN2 showed up in association studies. SLC39A8 appeared in the data. BYUB3, SADEM1, SNTB2, and AMIGO all have genetic variants that correlate with hand preference. Some of these genes are involved in brain development. AMIGON, for instance, is involved in growth and fasciculation of neurites, the processes that allow neurons to grow and connect with each other. Other genes are involved in cellular structure. The tubulin genes are critical for forming microtubules, which are essential components of cell structure and function. This tells us something interesting. The genes associated with left-handedness aren't randomly scattered throughout the genome. They cluster around functions related to brain development and neural organization. This makes biological sense. Left-handedness is ultimately about how the brain is organized, how hemispheric specialization develops, how motor control circuits are wired during development. These are profoundly neurological phenomena. The genes involved make sense, given what left-handedness actually is at a biological level. But here's what these genes don't do. They don't tell you about your ancestry. They don't reveal where your family came from. They don't mark you as belonging to a particular population or ethnic group or geographic region. Genes that relate to ancestry work completely differently. Ancestry genes are genes that vary significantly in frequency between different populations because those populations were geographically isolated for extended periods. They accumulated different mutations. They were subject to different selection pressures. They developed different genetic signatures. Over thousands of years, these differences become pronounced. When modern geneticists analyze ancestry, they look for exactly these kinds of differences. The problem with using left-handedness as an ancestry marker is that it doesn't show these population-level differences. Left-handedness exists at roughly 10% in virtually every human population studied. North America, 10%. Western Europe, 10%. Eastern Europe, 10%. East Asia, 10%. South Asia, 10%. Sub-Saharan Africa, 10%. The consistency is striking. If left-handedness variants were useful for distinguishing between populations, we would see significant variation. We would see 5% in one region and 15% in another. We would see clear geographic clustering. We don't see this. There are some small regional differences. The rates do vary slightly, but these small variations are best explained by the social and historical factors I mentioned earlier. They're explained by different timing and when societies stop suppressing left-handedness. They're not explained by genetic ancestry. They're not evidence that different populations have different propensities for left-handedness based on evolutionary history. Let me address one more finding from the research because it's worth understanding. Scientists have observed consistent sex differences in left-handedness. Men are more likely to be left-handed than women. The exact ratio varies slightly depending on the study and the population, but across multiple large data sets, men show left-handedness rates ranging from 10.5 to 15.6%. Women show rates from 9.3 to 12.6%. The odds ratio is approximately 1.3, meaning men are about 30% more likely to be left-handed than women. This sex difference is real, consistent, and appears to be biological rather than social. It's been observed across different countries and cultures. It's present even in societies with strong gender equality. It's probably related to hormonal influences during brain development or to sex chromosomes themselves. But critically, this sex difference exists across all populations. It's not specific to any geographic region. It doesn't tell you where someone is from. It tells you something about how sex influences brain development, but not about ancestry. Now let's discuss what researchers have learned about how left-handedness develops in the brain. Neuroscientists have discovered that hand preference emerges incredibly early, even before birth. Ultrasound studies have shown that human fetuses already exhibit hand preference during development in the womb. Some unborn babies preferentially move their right arm, others their left arm. This happens before any environmental input, before any cultural pressure, before any learning or training. This suggests that left-handedness has deep roots in neural development. The brain is fundamentally asymmetrical. The left and right hemispheres are not mirror images. They're specialized for different functions. The left hemisphere is dominant for language in most people. It controls detailed analytical thinking. The right hemisphere handles spatial relationships, emotional processing, and holistic thinking. In right-handed people, this asymmetry is quite pronounced. The left hemisphere is dominant for language in more than 95% of right-handers. In left-handed people, things are more complex. Only about 70% of left-handers have left hemisphere language dominance. The remaining 30% have different arrangements, either with language more evenly distributed between hemispheres, or even with right hemisphere dominance. This difference in brain organization is probably connected to the neural genes associated with left-handedness. The genes involved influence how the brain organizes itself during development. They influence hemispheric specialization. They influence how motor control circuits get wired. But again, this is neurobiology, not ancestry. This tells you about how your individual brain is organized. It doesn't tell you about your family's migration history. It doesn't tell you about your ancestral populations. It doesn't tell you where your ancestors lived thousands of years ago. Here's where I need to be particularly direct about the marketing deception. When companies sell you a left-handedness genetic test, they're selling you information about your neurological predisposition. They're analyzing your genetic profile and calculating a polygenic score based on the 41 variants associated with left-handedness. They're telling you how many of these variants you carry, and based on that, they're estimating your probability of being left-handed. Some claim they can predict whether you're a natural left-hander versus someone who was trained to be right-handed. But here's what's deeply misleading about this. The prediction is weakly accurate at best. Remember that genetics explains only 25% of left-handedness variation. Environmental factors explain 75%. Even the most sophisticated machine learning model, even the most complex statistical algorithm, can't accurately predict left-handedness from genetics alone because the environment is simply too dominant. The prediction would be right only about 30 to 40% of the time for any individual, which is barely better than random chance. The most reliable way to determine if someone is left-handed remains the oldest method. Watch them write. Ask them which hand they use. Observe their behavior. Genetic analysis might tell you about brain organization, about hemispheric specialization, about neurological development, but it won't reliably tell you which hand you actually use. And it absolutely, definitively, will not tell you where you're from. When companies imply or state that left-handedness genetics reveal ancestry, they're being deliberately misleading. They're taking a trait that exists in all human populations at similar rates and pretending it's a geographic marker. It's not. It's a fundamental aspect of human neural variation that's been present in consistent proportions throughout human history. Real ancestry genetics works completely differently. Legitimate ancestry tests analyze population-specific genetic variants that became common in certain geographic regions over evolutionary time. They look at haplogroups, which are groups of related genetic sequences that descend from a common ancestor. They examine your individual genetic profile and match it against reference databases of people from known geographic regions. They can build a picture of your ancestry because the variants they analyze actually differ in frequency between populations in meaningful ways that reflect evolutionary history and population migrations. Left-handedness variants don't work this way. They're not population-specific. They don't carry information about evolutionary history or geographic origin. They carry information about how your individual brain is likely to be organized, about your individual neurological development. That's valuable information, but it's fundamentally different from ancestry information. Let me give you some context on why this matters beyond just scientific accuracy. We live in a culture deeply invested in genetic determinism. There's a widespread assumption that everything about us, our talents, our abilities, our personalities, our destinies, are written in our genes. We search for the genetic basis of intelligence, of creativity, of athleticism, of mental health conditions. We want to believe that our DNA contains an instruction manual for who we are and what we can become. The reality is messier and more hopeful. For virtually every complex human trait, genetics is only part of the story. For left-handedness specifically, it's about 1/4 of the story. The other 3/4 comes from your environment, your experiences, your upbringing, your education, random developmental variation, and countless other factors. Understanding this actually matters for how we think about ourselves and our potential. If left-handedness were purely genetic, determined completely by your DNA, then it would be fixed and unchangeable. But it's not. People can be trained to use their non-preferred hand, and with practice, they can develop proficiency. Children raised in environments that discourage left-handedness often end up using their right hand, even if they carry genetic variants associated with left-handedness. This flexibility, this environmental influence, this complexity is actually more interesting than a simple genetic story. The most recent research continues to refine our understanding. In 2025, researchers are investigating epigenetic factors, looking at how environmental signals turn genes on and off. They're studying gene-environment interactions, the complex dance between genetic predisposition and environmental influence that produces observable traits. They're mapping neural circuits, trying to understand the precise mechanisms by which genetic variation in tubulin genes and other proteins influences how motor control gets organized in the brain. The picture that emerges is one of remarkable complexity. Scientists continue to study left-handedness because it's a window into how the brain develops, how neural asymmetry emerges, how motor control gets established. It's genuinely fascinating neuroscience, but it's neuroscience, not ancestry science. Understanding the genetics of left-handedness tells you about neurobiology. It doesn't tell you where your family comes from. Let me be very clear about what the current science actually supports. Yes, left-handedness has a genetic component. Yes, specific genes influence hand preference. Yes, about 25% of the variation in left-handedness is heritable. Yes, environmental factors overwhelmingly dominate, explaining 75% of the variation. And yes, there are absolutely no ancestry markers in left-handedness genetics. There is nothing in your genetic predisposition for left-handedness that reveals your geographic origin or ethnic background. When you take a legitimate ancestry DNA test, you learn real information about your family's history. You discover the populations your ancestors belonged to. You learn about migrations, about mixing of populations, about evolutionary history. You connect with genetic cousins around the world. You build a picture of your family's journey through human history. This is genuinely valuable and genuinely informative. But that information comes from completely different parts of your genetic code. It comes from variants that actually vary between populations. It comes from markers that show the signatures of evolutionary history and population isolation. It doesn't come from your left-handedness. Your left-handedness is about you as an individual, about your personal neurology, about how your specific brain is wired. It's not a message from your ancestors. It's not a map of where they came from. The scientific consensus is clear. Left-handedness is not an ancestry marker. It's not a geographic indicator. It's a neurological trait influenced by complex interactions between multiple genes and a dominant environmental component. The idea that your left-handedness reveals where you really come from is marketing fiction, not scientific fact. And here's the thing that should concern us. When scientific truths get distorted in service of marketing, when companies blur the line between different kinds of genetic information to make their products sound more profound or more revealing, we all lose. We lose the ability to understand what genetic science can actually tell us. We lose the ability to think critically about genetic testing. We lose the opportunity to appreciate the genuine, real insights that genetic science has to offer. Genetic science has genuinely revolutionary things to tell us about human history, about how populations migrated across the globe, about how we're related to each other, about how we develop the diseases we face, about how we might treat those diseases. Ancestry genetics is one of those revolutionary applications, but it works because it relies on population-level differences that have accumulated over thousands of years. Left-handedness doesn't show these population-level differences. It's not a population trait. It's an individual trait, a neurological variation that exists in all human populations. The research from 2024 and 2025 makes this crystal clear. 41 genetic variants located across multiple chromosomes, each with tiny individual effects, collectively contributing only about 25% to hand preference. 3/4 of the trait shaped by environment. No population-level differentiation, no ancestry signal. Just a fascinating window into how individual brains develop differently from each other, how neural organization varies within the human species, how a fundamental aspect of motor control gets established through the interplay of genetics and experience. So here's what you should take away from this. If you're left-handed, your DNA has revealed something real about you. It's revealed something about your neural development. It's revealed something about your brain organization. It's shown you that you're part of a consistent 10% of humanity that has always existed in all human societies. But your left-handedness has not revealed where you're from. It has not revealed your ancestry. It has not revealed your ethnic background. That requires different genetic information, different kinds of analysis, different parts of your genetic code. The next time you see a headline claiming that your left-handedness tells you about your ancestry, you'll know the truth. You'll know that science says otherwise. You'll know that the consistency of left-handedness across all human populations and all of human history suggests it's a fundamental part of human variation, not a marker of specific geographic origin. And you'll understand that while genetic science is genuinely powerful, it works by analyzing the right kinds of data for the right kinds of questions. Left-handedness tells you about neurobiology. Ancestry markers tell you about evolutionary history. They're not the same thing, and conflating them does science no favors. Your DNA is genuinely fascinating. It does contain real information about who you are and where you come from, but you have to know which information goes where, which genes carry which signals, which traits reveal which truths. Understanding that distinction is what separates scientific literacy from marketing mythology. And that distinction matters more than ever in a world drowning in genetic information and genetic claims. So the next time someone tries to sell you a story about what your left-handedness reveals, remember what the science actually says. Remember that 41 genes explain only 25% of the variation. Remember that 75% comes from environment. Remember that left-handedness has existed at the same rate in all human populations throughout history. And remember that your DNA tells many different stories, and you have to listen carefully to understand which story applies to which question.